I'm Kimberly, and I was born into what you'd call an ordinary family. My parents made good money, but they weren't exactly rolling in it. I had an older brother, 5 years my senior, and let me tell you, he was the golden child. Our parents sent my brother to some fancy private school with all the bells and whistles. Meanwhile, I was shuffled off to the local public school. Don't get me wrong, it wasn't terrible, but the difference was night and day. I remember this one time when I was about 8. I'd just finished watching a music video of this amazing singer, and I was so inspired. I ran to my mom, all excited, and said, "Mom, can I take singing lessons, please?" She just looked at me like I'd grown a second head. Singing lessons? Kimberly, don't be ridiculous. That's just a silly hobby. You need to focus on getting a real job when you grow up. My dad chimed in, "Your brother's the smart one in the family. You'll need to work with your hands, sweetie. No use wasting money on singing lessons." So I started looking up vocal lessons online. I'd practice in my room, trying to keep it down so my parents wouldn't complain. "Kimberly, stop that racket" became a common phrase in our house. Things might have stayed that way if it wasn't for my Aunt Sarah. She was my mom's sister, didn't have any kids of her own. She was a dentist, made good money, and for some reason she seemed to actually like hanging out with me. One day, she caught me singing in my room. I was so embarrassed, but she just smiled. "Kimberly, that was beautiful," she said. "Why didn't you tell me you could sing?" I shrugged, feeling my cheeks burn. Mom and Dad say it's silly. Aunt Sarah's face did this weird thing like she was trying not to frown. "Well, I think it's wonderful. How about we get you some proper lessons?" From that day on, everything changed. Aunt Sarah became my secret weapon. She bought me a synthesizer, and we'd spend hours learning songs together. It was like having a whole new world open up to me. When my parents found out about the lessons, they weren't thrilled. Mom even had the nerve to tell Aunt Sarah, "You should be giving that money to our son instead." But Aunt Sarah? She just smiled that calm smile of hers and said, "I think Kimberly has a real talent. I'm happy to nurture it." That was the first time anyone had ever stood up for me like that. It made me feel seen. Like maybe I wasn't just the family disappointment after all. While I was scraping by with my singing lessons, my brother was living the high life. One day he came home all excited about hockey. "Mom, Dad, I want to play hockey," he announced at dinner. I nearly choked on my peas. Last month it was tennis. The month before that, American football. And don't even get me started on his brief rugby phase. But did our parents hesitate? Nope. Dad just nodded and said, "Sure, son, we'll sign you up tomorrow." To no one's surprise, hockey didn't stick either. Neither did any of the other sports. My brother bounced from one activity to another like a pinball, never really excelling at anything. Then came the esports phase. Oh boy. "I need a gaming computer," he announced one day. "Top of the line. And I need my own room for training and competitions." I waited for my parents to finally put their foot down. But nope. They just nodded along like bobbleheads. "Of course, honey," Mom cooed. "We'll set everything up for you." And they did. They converted the guest room into his personal gaming paradise. The computer they bought him cost more than my entire wardrobe. Meanwhile, I was still sharing a room with my cousin's hand-me-down synthesizer. The worst part was the wall of fame in our living room. It was this massive display of all my brother's achievements. I use that term loosely. There were participation certificates from every sport he'd quit, academic awards from his fancy private school, even a best smile certificate from his 3rd grade yearbook. And me? Not a single spot on that wall. Not even a tiny corner for my straight A's or the singing competition I'd won at school. Things really came to a head when it was time for college. My brother, of course, got into some Ivy League school. Mom and Dad were over the moon. They paid for everything: tuition, a fancy apartment off campus, a new car. The works. 4 years flew by. I focused on my singing, on school, on anything to keep my mind off the unfairness of it all. Aunt Sarah was my rock through it all, always there with a word of encouragement or a new song to learn. Then, one sunny afternoon, my brother burst through the front door. He had this girl with him, all giggly and hanging off his arm. "Mom," Daddy shouted, "I've got news." They came running, of course, always at his beck and call. "This is Melissa," he said, grinning like he'd just won the lottery. "We got married last week. She's moving in with us." I thought Mom was going to faint from happiness. Dad started talking about clearing out more space, maybe converting the attic. As everyone fussed over the happy couple, I slipped away to my room. I had a bad feeling about what was coming next, and boy was I right. The next month was like living in a bizarre parallel universe. Mom and Dad were all over my brother and his new wife, Melissa. They were redecorating his room, buying new furniture, even talking about building an extension to the house. Meanwhile, I was invisible. More than usual, I mean. I tried to focus on my future. I'd graduated high school with honors, not that anyone noticed, and was eyeing this small college with a decent vocal program. It wasn't fancy, but it was something. I knew Mom and Dad had been saving for my college fund. It wasn't much, but it would cover the basics. Or so I thought. One morning, about a month after the happy couple moved in, Mom and Dad called me into the living room. I should have known something was up when I saw their faces. "Kimberly," Dad started, his voice oddly formal. "We need to talk about your future. We've decided to use your college fund to cover your living expenses for the past 18 years. I blinked, sure I'd heard wrong. "What?" "You're an adult now," Dad continued, not meeting my eyes. "It's time you started paying your own way." The room started to spin. But what about college? I was counting on that money. Mom's face hardened. "Your brother is married now. He needs more space and money for his family. We're giving him your room." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "So what? I'm just supposed to leave? Where am I supposed to go?" "You'll need to find a job and your own place to live," Dad said, like he was discussing the weather. "You won't be able to afford college without money." Something inside me snapped. For the first time in my life, I felt real, burning anger towards my parents. "You can't do this. I'm your daughter. I'm not going anywhere. This is my home too." For a moment, nobody moved. Then Mom stormed out of the room. I thought that was it, that maybe they'd reconsider. But she came back with a suitcase. "Fine," she spat. "If you won't leave, I'll pack for you." She started grabbing my things, throwing them haphazardly into the suitcase. I stood there, frozen in shock. That's when I noticed my brother and Melissa standing in the doorway, watching the whole scene with smug smiles on their faces. Something in me broke. This wasn't my family. These weren't the people who were supposed to love and support me. I pushed past Mom and started packing my own things. I grabbed my clothes, my few pieces of jewelry, and most importantly, the music books and recordings Aunt Sarah had given me over the years. Nobody said a word as I packed. Nobody tried to stop me. And when I walked out the front door, dragging my suitcase behind me, nobody called me back. I found myself on Aunt Sarah's doorstep, my whole life packed into one measly suitcase. When she opened the door and saw my tear-stained face, she didn't ask questions. She just pulled me into a hug and said, "Oh, Kimberly, come in, sweetheart." That night, over a cup of hot cocoa, I spilled everything. Aunt Sarah listened, her face growing darker with each word. When I finished, she took my hand and squeezed it tight. "You're staying here," she said firmly, "and tomorrow we're going to figure out your future." I slept better that night than I had in years, knowing I was finally somewhere I was wanted. The next morning, Aunt Sarah dropped a bombshell on me. "I'm paying for your college," she announced over breakfast. "I've been saving for years, hoping to help you chase your dreams. This is what that money is for." We spent the next few weeks researching colleges. Aunt Sarah suggested we look into programs that combined acting and singing. "You've got a gift, Kimberly," she said. "Let's find somewhere that'll help you shine." We finally settled on a performing arts college in a city a few hours away. It had an amazing reputation and offered exactly the kind of training I'd always dreamed of. When it came time for the entrance exams, Aunt Sarah took time off work and drove me there herself. I sang my heart out, poured every ounce of emotion into my performance piece. When I finished, the panel of judges was silent for a moment. Then they broke into applause. A week later, I got the acceptance letter. I was in. I threw myself into my studies. Every class, every rehearsal, every late-night practice session, I gave it my all. I signed up for every singing competition I could find, performed in every amateur theater production that would have me. If there was a part in a musical, no matter how small, I was there, auditioning my heart out. Before I knew it, 4 years had flown by. I graduated with honors, my final showcase performance earning a standing ovation. And that's when things really took off. A rep from a big musical theater studio was in the audience that night. He approached me after the show, talking fast about potential and opportunities. Next thing I knew, I was signing a contract with one of the biggest names in the business. Suddenly, I wasn't just performing in college productions or local theaters. I was on real stages, in front of real audiences, playing lead roles in honest-to-God professional musicals. It was terrifying and exhilarating and everything I'd ever wanted. Through it all, Aunt Sarah was my rock. She came to every performance she could, always sitting in the front row, always the first one on her feet for a standing ovation. We'd go for late-night pancakes after each show, and she'd gush about every little detail of my performance. Looking at her beaming face across the table, I realized something. This woman, who had no obligation to me beyond being my mother's sister, had given me more love and support than my own parents ever had. She wasn't just my aunt anymore. She was the mom I'd always wished I had. Life was going great. I had just landed a lead role in a new musical that was generating serious buzz. One afternoon, I dropped by Aunt Sarah's place, bursting with excitement about my plans and prospects. "Aunt Sarah, you won't believe what's happening," I gushed, detailing my upcoming projects and dreams. She listened with that warm smile of hers, but as I was getting ready to leave, she dropped a bombshell. "Kimberly," she said gently, "you've grown into such a wonderful young woman. Don't you think it's time to reconcile with your parents? They're still your family, dear." I wanted to argue, but the hopeful look in her eyes stopped me. After everything she'd done for me, how could I refuse? "Okay," I said reluctantly. "I'll try." The next day, I found myself standing on my parents' doorstep, feeling like a stranger. Mom answered, her eyes widening in surprise. "Kimberly," she said, like she wasn't sure it was really me. "Hi, Mom," I replied, forcing a smile. "Can I come in?" They let me stay, but it was clear I wasn't welcome. The house felt different, colder somehow, and get this, my brother was still living there. Apparently his wife had been kicked out. Mom grumbled something about her playing video games all day and refusing to help around the house or get a job. For days I endured their frosty silence and disapproving looks. I was about ready to call it quits when my brother cornered me in the kitchen. "So," he sneered, "still chasing that silly singing dream? Let me guess, you're a star in some dingy bar now." Something in me snapped. I stood up straight, looked him in the eye and said, "Actually, I'm the lead singer in several successful musicals. And I'm doing quite well for myself, thank you." You should have seen their faces. It was like someone had flipped a switch. Suddenly, Mom and Dad couldn't stop asking questions. "Musicals?" "Really?" Dad pressed. "How much do you make?" I tried to leave, but Mom practically blocked the door. "You must be making good money," she insisted. "How much is your contract worth?" "That's confidential," I said, trying to edge past her. Dad's face hardened. "Now listen here, young lady. After everything we've done for you, you owe us. We're your parents. You're obligated to help us and your brother." And just like that, I was 18 again, standing in the same house being told I wasn't worth investing in. But this time, I wasn't that scared, insecure girl anymore. "I don't owe you anything," I said, my voice steady. "You kicked me out, remember? Told me I wasn't worth supporting. Well, guess what? I made it without you, and I don't need you now." I headed straight to Aunt Sarah's house. She took one look at my face and opened her arms. As I hugged her, I knew this was my real family. This was home. Life has a cruel way of pulling the rug out from under you just when things seem to be going well. I was riding high on my success, performing in sold-out shows night after night, when I got the call that changed everything. Aunt Sarah had cancer. The world seemed to stop spinning. I wanted to drop everything and rush to her side, but she insisted I keep performing. "Your dreams are my dreams too," she told me over the phone, her voice weaker than I'd ever heard it. "Don't you dare give them up for me." So I kept touring, but every free moment I had, I spent with her. We'd sit in her garden, talking about everything and nothing. I tried to memorize every detail of her face, the sound of her laugh, the way her eyes crinkled when she smiled. But cancer is a merciless enemy. Despite the treatments, despite our hopes and prayers, Aunt Sarah's condition worsened rapidly. And then, one day, while I was in the middle of a tour, I got the call I'd been dreading. Aunt Sarah was gone. I was lucky, if you can call anything about this situation lucky, that I had a few days break between shows. I caught the first flight home, my heart feeling like it was being squeezed in a vice. As soon as the funeral was over, I had to fly back. The show must go on, as they say. But every performance felt hollow now. I sang the notes, hit the marks, but my heart wasn't in it. How could it be, when it was shattered into a million pieces? When the tour finally ended, I returned home, exhausted and grieving. That's when I got a call from a notary. Apparently Aunt Sarah had left a will, and I needed to come in to discuss it. I went to the notary's office, not really caring about what Aunt Sarah might have left me. Nothing could replace her. But when the notary started reading the will, I couldn't believe my ears. Aunt Sarah had left me everything. Her house, her savings, all of it. I broke down crying right there in the notary's office. In the following days, I moved into Aunt Sarah's house. I was starting to feel like maybe, just maybe, I could move forward when my past came knocking literally. One afternoon there was a pounding on the door. I opened it to find my brother standing there, looking disheveled and desperate. "I need money," he blurted out before I could even say hello. "My wife's pregnant, and I left Mom and Dad. They've been driving me crazy with their nagging and criticizing. You've got to help me, Kimmy." I stood there, stunned. After everything that had happened, this was how he approached me. "Why don't you get a job?" I suggested, trying to keep my voice level. His face contorted in disgust. "A job? I don't need a job, I need money. You've got plenty now, don't you? That old lady left you everything." That old lady comment made my blood boil. That old lady was more family to me than you ever were, I spat. "And no, I won't give you money." His eyes narrowed. "You tricked her, didn't you? Manipulated that senile old woman into giving you everything. You're nothing but a thief. I'll take you to court, you'll see." Something in me snapped. All the grief, all the anger I'd been holding in came rushing out. "Get out," I snarled. "Get out of my house right now. You want to take me to court? Go ahead. Try explaining to a judge how the sister you abandoned deserves your handouts. Go on, get out." I slammed the door in his face, my whole body shaking. As I leaned against the closed door, I realized something. This house, this inheritance, it wasn't just a gift. It was Aunt Sarah's final act of love, her way of protecting me even after she was gone. Just when I thought the drama with my brother was over, my phone rang. It was my parents. I almost didn't answer, but something made me press the green button. Kimberly, my mother's voice came through, sickly sweet. "We heard about the inheritance. Don't you think you should share some of that with your family? After all, Sarah was our relative too." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Are you serious right now?" I asked, my voice ice cold. "Now, Kimberly," my mother cooed, "we're just saying, family should help family. You've got so much now. Surely you can spare some for us." That was it. The last straw. "Family," I spat. "You want to talk about family? Where was your sense of family when you kicked me out? When you told me I wasn't worth investing in? When you chose my brother over me every single time?" There was silence on the other end. "Let me remind you of something," I continued, my voice shaking with anger. "Aunt Sarah left me everything because she believed in me when you didn't. She supported me when you abandoned me. You don't get to be family now that it's convenient for you." I heard my mother's sharp intake of breath. Then my father's voice, cold and hard. "You ungrateful little rubbish. After everything we've done for you." I hung up. My hands were shaking, but I felt lighter. Like I'd finally said everything I'd been holding in for years. But it wasn't over. Far from it. The next day I started seeing posts on social media. My parents were on a warpath, posting long, teary-eyed statuses about how their daughter had stolen their sister's inheritance. How I was a manipulative thief who couldn't even be bothered to organize a proper funeral for my aunt. It was all lies, of course. The funeral had been beautiful, exactly as Aunt Sarah would have wanted. But the truth didn't matter to them. They were out for blood. Relatives I hadn't spoken to in years were suddenly in my inbox, calling me horrible names. Old acquaintances left nasty comments on my photos. It felt like the whole world was turning against me. Every day brought new threats, new insults. My parents created fake profiles to harass me when I blocked their main accounts. My brother joined in, spinning wild tales about how I'd tricked a senile old woman out of her money. Then I heard through the grapevine that they were planning to sue me. My brother, my parents, they were all looking for lawyers to contest the will. For a moment, panic set in. What if they won? What if they took away this last gift from Aunt Sarah? I hired a lawyer of my own, just in case. But it turned out I didn't need to worry. My lawyer smiled when I told him about the threats of a lawsuit. They don't have a leg to stand on, he assured me. The will is ironclad. Your aunt was of sound mind when she made it, and she was clear about her wishes. They can try to sue, but they'll lose. And they'll lose badly. Hearing that was like a weight lifting off my shoulders. The law was on my side. Aunt Sarah's wishes would be respected. The harassment didn't stop overnight, but knowing I was in the right gave me strength. I started blocking accounts, reporting the worst offenders for harassment. Slowly but surely, the tide of public opinion started to turn. 2 years flew by in a whirlwind of spotlights, standing ovations, and dreams come true. I had become the successful musical actress Aunt Sarah always knew I could be. My face graced billboards, my voice filled theaters, and I even found myself on TV, still pinching myself to make sure it wasn't all a dream. Life was good. Really good. I was touring internationally, singing my heart out on stages I'd only ever imagined. Every performance felt like a tribute to Aunt Sarah, a way to honor her belief in me. Then came the night that changed everything, again. I was back in my home state for a series of shows. It was a sold-out performance, the energy in the theater electric. As I stood center stage, pouring my soul into a heart-wrenching ballad, the entire audience holding their breath, it happened. 2 figures stood up abruptly, unfurling a large, hastily made poster. Even from the stage, I could make out the words, "Kimberly stole our money." My heart stopped. I'd recognize those voices anywhere. My parents. "She's a thief," my father bellowed. "She manipulated her aunt and stole our inheritance." The spell of the performance shattered. Whispers rippled through the audience, growing into a confused murmur. My co-stars froze, unsure what to do. I stood there, spotlight burning into me, feeling like that scared 18-year-old girl all over again. But only for a moment. As security rushed to remove my parents, as the stage manager frantically tried to regain control, something inside me snapped into place. This was my stage, my life, my moment. I stepped forward, my voice cutting through the chaos. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for this interruption. Unfortunately, those people are my estranged parents who have been harassing me for years. But you know what? Their actions can't touch me anymore. Because every time I step on this stage, I'm living my dream, and no one can take that away from me." The theater fell silent. Then, slowly, applause began to build. It grew and grew until it was a roar, drowning out my parents' continued shouts as they were escorted out. We finished the show, and it was one of the best performances of my life. Every note, every step felt like an act of defiance, a declaration of my right to be there. The next morning I called my lawyer. Enough was enough. It was time to end this, once and for all. We went to court, armed with years of evidence, social media posts, threatening messages, eyewitness accounts of their disruption. The case was clear-cut. The judge issued a restraining order against my parents, legally barring them from contacting me or coming near my performances. In the years that followed, my career soared to new heights. I traveled the world, performing in cities I'd only ever dreamed of visiting. Every new stage, every new audience was a thrill. My parents and brother became distant memories, faces I might pass on the street without a second glance. They were no longer a part of my story. Instead, I built a new family. Fellow performers, friends who stuck by me through thick and thin, fans whose lives I touched with my music, and at the center of it all, the memory of a woman who saw a spark in a young girl and did everything she could to help it blaze into a fire.